Welcome to News Talk with Simone Ivani at the International News Channel. June 23 marks the 36th anniversary of the bombing of Air India Flight 182 that took the lives of the 329 passengers that were on board. The incident is also recognized as the largest terrorist attack in Canadian history, the deadliest aviation incident in the history of Air India, and was the deadliest act of aviation terrorism until the September 11 attacks in 2001. Although many were arrested and tried for the crime, to this date, only one man, Inderjeet Singh Rayat, has been convicted of this mass murder. Rayat and his co-conspirators were all members of the Babbar Khalsa group, as a political weapon in their efforts to create an independent home country called Khalistan. This radical group created a bomb, which was then put into a suitcase. The suitcase was checked in to be boarded onto the plane. The question following the incident was, how could such an attack happen? And how did such a suitcase go unnoticed? Joining us today to discuss this horrific event is Chris Alexander. Chris served as Canada's Minister of Citizenship and Immigration from 2013 to 2015. He was elected as a Conservative MP in 2011 and completed his term in 2015. Thank you for joining me today, Chris, to commemorate and discuss the atrocious events of the 1985 Air India flight bombing. First of all, thank you for joining us, Chris.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
In your opinion, do you think that it is important that Canadians remember this tragedy?
Well, it's a painful celebration for all Canadians, obviously. The victims' families are still, for the most part, with us. You know, people, friends and family who knew the victims. But it's particularly important because this remains, in spite of many unfortunate incidents since then, the largest scale act of terrorism in Canadian history. And we live in an era when terrorism has become a regular, harsh, bitter reality in our lives and in the lives of too many people around the world. It's a threat that some countries face on an enormous scale, but it's a global threat that can affect any of us. And so Canada has a duty, I think, as a country that is relatively successful in striving for peace, order, good government, justice, overcoming the injustices of the past, to understand this act of terrorism, to remember its victims, and to strive to ensure that this country is neither an arena for terrorist acts nor a platform in which organizations can raise money, organize, radicalize people to take part in acts of terrorism anywhere in the world. And that's a big challenge. We certainly don't meet that challenge every day, but this commemoration reminds us why it's so important.
When you were in office, what did your Conservative government do to further investigate and find the truth about the events that occurred on the Air India Flight 182 in 1985?
I think we did more to elevate the celebration, to draw attention to it, to remind everyone that the radicalism that went into that terrible attack, and some of the perpetrators of the attack, organizers of the attack, who were themselves Canadians, have their successors today and have people who are inspired by the same ideology today. So we did, as a government, expand the list of organizations and entities that we consider terrorist entities in Canada. We expanded the reach of sanctions. We talked a lot about the need to do more, not only about groups and entities that are embracing terrorism, but about states that are sponsoring terrorism. Mm-hmm. And here I think there are two main subjects. You may have others you want to explore, but to my mind, today, the two biggest state sponsors of terrorism, and if you look at Canada's list of organizations that are designated under our legislation as terrorist organizations, really a third to a half of them have links to these two countries. Those are the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Islamic Republic of Pakistan.
Do you think that there's anything the current government should be doing to either support the victims of the tragedy or to further investigate the attack?
I think they should be doing much more to investigate this practice of state sponsorship of terrorism, which brought horrors to the Israeli civilian population last month. The group, most Canadians don't know, and most Americans don't know that Hamas, this group that launched thousands of rockets at Israel only recently, is an Iranian military outfit. It is effectively an irregular branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards who take terrorism and proxy war into half a dozen countries. And this is only one of their most spectacular attacks or offensives in recent days. Ask the population of Yemen, of Syria, of Iraq, of Lebanon, what kind of practices these proxies and these terrorist groups embrace, and you will find a very dark story. Similarly, Pakistan, as a state sponsor of terrorism, is now seeking to reconquer Afghanistan, a country that Canada and the whole NATO alliance sought to defend, where we made progress in establishing democracy, women's rights, education, etc., and where all of that is under threat because we haven't done enough to face up to the challenge of state-sponsored terrorism. In Afghanistan's case, through the Taliban and allied groups, but this terrorism that is sponsored out of Pakistan reaches Kashmir, as you know, many parts of India in spectacular attacks, and there are partnerships and linkages between Pakistani groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and others around the world, which are literally a threat to international peace and security and should be treated as such, in my view.
So the Air India flight bombing that was organized by a terrorist group that was, or is for that matter, fighting for a separate Khalistan. What do you think in that sense about the Air India bombing in particular?
Well, I think we made some progress as a country in pushing back the frontiers of our understanding of that attack. This idea of Khalistan and a violent campaign to reestablish a Khalistan, a separate state on the territory of what is today Indian Punjab, was sponsored by Pakistan's inter-services intelligence. It was a long-term project of theirs to radicalize a small group of Sikh extremists in Canada, in the UK, and elsewhere to embrace this struggle. And it did result in violence for a time in India, and it didn't result in attacks such as the tragic Air India bombing that we commemorate in Canada. But this effort by Pakistan to radicalize and operate through proxies, including terrorist groups, to visit violence on India has not gone away. Indians face it almost every day. They see it as their top security threat. India is a democracy. Pakistan is very far from being a true democracy in that freedom of speech has been more or less extinguished. Certainly when it comes to discussing these sorts of security issues, it's gone. There is a selected, managed democracy with the army very much in charge. But the level of international attention to Pakistan's agenda remains piteously low. And in Canada, for several decades, we weren't aware of the links, or the public certainly wasn't aware of the links between Pakistan's intelligence services and the Khalistani movement. That has changed recently with the publication of Terry Milevsky's excellent report on this issue for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and now with the release of his recent book on the same subject, which complements books by Indian authors and others on Pakistan's agenda in Indian Punjab, which is really an extension of their policy of radicalizing groups in Kashmir to ensure that there's a continuous torrent of violence, unfortunately, running through those valleys.
Coming back a bit to the Air India bombing and the Canadian government, a lot of the victims said that they didn't feel supported by the government when the attack occurred. They described it how it was treated as an international attack occurring elsewhere instead of an attack committed against Canadians and planned within Canada. So what do you think about that?
Yes, I think Canadians, not just the victims, but all Canadians have to do much more to listen to that point of view and to accept that we aren't just multilateral players in larger narratives that happen elsewhere. We are sometimes the place where these narratives are born, where these tragedies start. And the organizers, the masterminds of this attack were in Vancouver. And that story is well documented. There were some prosecutions and convictions, but not all of those involved in the plot were brought to justice. And it should be a continuing struggle, I think, in the spirit of Canada's commitment to justice and commitment to commemoration of people who are victims of such attacks and tragedies, whether they're made whether the plots were hatched in Canada or elsewhere. We should remain committed to owning this to the extent it was a made in Canada tragedy, and to working with all of our international partners to make sure it doesn't happen again. I think Terry Milewski's books and his work on this as a journalist over decades are a very good starting point for everyone's efforts in this regard. But no, I agree with you. No Canadian government has done as much as we should have to recognize the victims, to give them the support that they need, and to listen to their message, which is really one of never again, and which we need to take especially seriously here because the plot began here. I should also mention that there are other air tragedies, forms of terrorism, really, in that these were attacks on civilian aircraft involving Canadians in recent years that need to be taken more seriously. One is the recent Ukrainian Airlines attack outside of Tehran, which was clearly a hostile act, an act of terrorism by the Iranian state, and in which dozens of Canadians were killed, as well as even more people who were studying in Canada and who had families in Canada. And then there was the Russian downing of the Malaysian Airlines flight over Ukraine at the start of Putin's invasion of that country, in which a Canadian died. And when we fail to learn the lessons of previous attacks and carry justice forward and make the connections with states that need to be made in previous attacks, then we see other countries with similarly ruthless regimes and a lack of scrupulousness turning to the same tactics as a way of sowing fear and intimidation in their own populations and the world. And I think it's a shame that the Biden administration, for example, is leading an effort now to relax sanctions on a country that recently downed a civilian aircraft, bombed Israel, the largest democracy in the Middle East, and is fighting proxy wars in half a dozen countries.
Do you think that if the victims had been white, the response and investigation would have been different?
Yes. I mean, they were Canadian nationals, Canadian citizens in the legal sense, but yeah, with ancestry in India for the most part. I agree with you. I think if these had been Canadians who were not associated with a recent wave of immigration, the case might have been taken differently. There is a tendency on the part of Canada and Canadians who are not immigrants to see, and this has always been the case, over centuries, to see those who are more recent arrivals as having brought their complicated disputes and conflicts from their home countries to Canada, and we in Canada are just determined to ignore those issues. This happened when the Irish were a dominant immigrant group, and there was conflict in Ireland. It happened at some points in the 20th century when people were fleeing communism in Eastern Europe. And it's happened ever since as successive waves of immigration and indeed refugees have come from different parts of the world for a better life in Canada. But that's a naive approach. We are more connected, more internationally active, not just as government, but as businesses, as universities, as a society internationally than we ever have been. And we can't ignore the conflicts to which we are connected because our citizens are from those countries and because Canada has a voice and a role to play. We were involved recently in Afghanistan for the better part of 2 decades as donors, as contributors to a military campaign, and in combat. We can't forget what that mission was about. We can't forget that it's still not over. And behind those Taliban are the same Pakistani institutions, Pakistan's intelligence services, notably the ISI, Pakistan's military, that radicalized Sikhs at an earlier stage, decades earlier, to carry out terrorist attacks like the Air India bombing. So there are certain scarlet threads, crimson threads that run through our history that we need to understand better. And we are at our best when Canada takes principled positions, especially principled political positions that involve sanctions, isolating those who are really in grievous violation of international norms. We've done that in some cases, but we haven't done it enough, and we need, to be honest, the journalists, the researchers, the elected office holders who have knowledge and experience to be advocates for this kind of action. We do have quite a few of each of those categories, but we need more if we're going to approach the rest of this 21st century with our eyes wide open.
That's more on the professional side, I would say. But so what do you think that the Canadian citizens, people like me and you, should be taking away from this tragedy, as in the Air India bombing, or even any other kind of terrorist attacks that are happening on Canadian soil?
Terrorism doesn't grow in a vacuum. It's still with us, but it is still a going concern today and a real threat today because it has sponsors. And as I mentioned, the 2 state sponsors of terrorism, leading state sponsors of terrorist groups that Canada and most other democracies list as such are Iran and Pakistan. But keep in mind that extremism and radical groups are thriving because of ideologies that are being fed by other players as well. Disinformation and propaganda are absolutely central tools for Putin's Russia and China under the current Chinese Communist Party as they seek to undermine democracy, freedom of speech, and moderate politics in our countries. And so if we have a homegrown, sometimes white supremacist, sometimes anti-Semitic, sometimes anti-Muslim set of groups inside Canada and an even larger set in the United States, that's partly because the ecosystem fed by this disinformation has grown hugely in the last 10 years. And that's going to be one of the terrorist realities that we have to face up to. Canadians need to understand it. I think every Canadian news organization should have someone specializing in disinformation, where it comes from, what it looks like today, and helping Canadians. They should maybe even have a team of such people helping guide Canadians through this minefield. We don't want to shut down the internet. We don't want to shut down freedom of speech, but we want people to be able to distinguish between conspiracy theories, absolutely state-sponsored make-believe, and propaganda on the one hand, and healthy debate even when it's provocative on the other hand. The latter is the salvation of democracy, the essence of democracy. The former is a real threat.
And speaking of the inquiry on the bombing, the inquiry that was initiated by the Conservative government then, entitled Air India Flight 182, A Canadian Tragedy, revealed a lot of missteps taken under the Mulroney government in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, as well as the subsequent mistreatment of victims' families. Do you think that Canada is better prepared to handle these kinds of threats today?
I think we're somewhat better prepared, but not enough. I don't think we've been nearly active enough under this government in responding to the Malaysian Airlines attack by Russia, where the Netherlands government has taken a lead in trying to bring about accountability, but they haven't had the level of support from allies that I think this issue deserves, especially from a country like Canada, which is so heavily involved in Ukraine and ensuring that Ukraine is able to resist Russia's invasion and maintain its sovereignty. And secondly, the more recent attack, again involving a Ukrainian aircraft, but where most of the passengers, the plurality of passengers, were Canadians, were students coming to study in Canada. We should be taking a lead in holding the Iranian regime to account for that absolutely unacceptable act of terrorism. And we should be countering this disinformation and propaganda which has been coming at us from the Iranian side with regard to that issue, thick and fast, ever since the day those lives were lost. So we've made some progress since the Air India tragedy, but recent events show we're still pretty much babes in arms when it comes to speaking out about international terrorism, putting our feet down, and ensuring that the states that are involved face real consequences for their actions. We haven't been tough enough, and we've got to do more.
In your opinion, has the treatment of victims of these terrorist attacks improved?
Well, I would leave it to the Air India victims' families to be the judges of that. There's always more that we can do. I mean, it's really impossible to explain to the spouse or the children of a victim of that tragedy why there were so many missteps in the investigation itself, some of which prevented perpetrators from facing justice. I mean, that's inexcusable, and sometimes the results of those mistakes can't be reversed. But commemoration is important. Compensation is important. In the case of the Iranian act of terrorism involving so many Canadians, there's already talk and some promises from the Iranian side of compensation. We should be much, much more demanding, I think, in ensuring that if Iran doesn't do right by the victims and their families, their resources abroad are frozen or even confiscated for the sake of victims. That's one area where, in terms of legislation, we made some progress. We can, as Canada, take action under statute to seize assets of states that are involved in terrorism or organizations that are involved in terrorism, to direct those assets to the benefit of victims. I would like to see that done in real time for the victims of recent attacks and for those victims of past attacks that haven't received the recognition and the compensation they deserve.
Finally, based on your expertise, how do you think Canadian government and Canadians ourselves can be protected from such terrorist attacks?
Well, we have to deter them. We have to show that we understand this is the policy of certain states, that we are doing everything we can with our partners to ensure there are penalties for that kind of policy, to shrink the incentives that those, perverse as they may be, that those states now see for embracing such policies. And then we need to ensure that when Canadians are effective, we respond very robustly. I don't think any Canadian government has been sufficiently robust in our own names and with allies in responding to these sorts of attacks. When we are only learning pertinent facts about who was involved decades later, then clearly we haven't done enough. So part of that has to involve intelligence. Part of that has to involve public education about the states in the world that represent threats to Canada. I mentioned Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan. I think they go at the top of the list, but there are other states as well. And we can't shy away from these issues. When they are swept under the carpet, we tend to pay an even greater price later on, because we have averted our gaze when we should be confronting these issues. And I think if we do that, we'll find people, other countries around the world, that will join us, and we'll also give a lot of hope and inspiration to those inside to people inside these countries that are suffering even more than Canadians are, obviously. So there's work to be done here if we want to be taken as leaders. Some of it has to involve painting the picture properly. Some of it has to involve criminal justice and compensation. And some of it has to involve the political actions necessary to really isolate those actors on the international stage that are still engaged, that are still embracing terrorism as a tool of state policy. It's absolutely unacceptable. It goes against the UN Charter, UN conventions of all kinds, and there's no support for it in public opinion anywhere. And the only possible benefit is through fear and intimidation. And whenever we give in to, whenever we have a fearful or hesitant response, we're actually helping those advocates of terrorism in these countries that perpetrate these attacks. We need to be bold, we need to be fearless, we need to say it like it is, and then we need to take action.
I absolutely agree. And thank you for joining us, Chris. It's been a pleasure to hear your thoughts on the events of the Air India flight bombing, as well as all the terrorist attacks in more recent history. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're watching the International News Channel. I am Simone Ivani. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell notifications to stay up to date on our latest videos.